patriotism, faith, national unity, education, fiscal responsibility, civility, the values that define America. Fascinating stories and talks from America-loving patriots dedicated to preserving freedom, opportunity, and justice. Welcome to the Friends and Fellow Citizens podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 139 of Friends and Fellow Citizens. I'm your host, Sherman Tylowski. Thank you all so much for joining me for this episode of our Sacred Honor series, where we cover the signers of the Declaration of Independence in order of their signatures. Today, we are kicking off a new group of delegates, this time from the colony of Pennsylvania, and very convenient because we just had a guest for the previous interview episode from Pennsylvania as well. So if you haven't checked that episode out and other interview and solo episodes, be sure to go to georgewashingtoninstitute.org or on your favorite podcast app. First of all, I want to always thank our Patreon supporters for their unwavering support for the show. Without them, honestly, I don't think I'd be able to get to where I am today. Also, a big shout out to our listeners as well, and those who are tuning in, welcome to the program. I hope you enjoy this content and many other episodes that we have recorded before and episodes in the future. Make sure to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens if you haven't already. And with that, let's kick off with our first delegate and signer from Pennsylvania, Robert Morris. Now, today's episode is going to be a lot about money, and while I don't have a whole lot of money to offer you right now with this episode, but we are going to be talking about money here, and no, it's not about Ben Franklin. Ben Franklin will be coming later on in this series, but today we'll be focusing on a wealthy person who I didn't really know a whole lot about. Now, I follow college football, and sometimes you see these kind of names of different schools, and one school that I recall seeing is named Robert Morris University, and I've kind of had a guess because it's in Pennsylvania. I was like, oh, probably this is named after after the signer, Robert Morris, whom I had heard of before at some point before. Robert Morris was born in Liverpool in 1734. He was very much in the shipping business and really was a prominent merchant as he grew up. Now, he lost his father when he was a pretty young age, and so he really had to take on this business literally on top of all the other responsibilities I'm sure he had to be a part of. I guess when it came to family and education. But I'm sure he learned a lot just from that real hand experience of becoming a self-made man in a lot of ways. He helped co-found a company called the Willing, Morris and Company. So he partnered with a few other business investors. And he was one of the pioneers of capitalism at the time. And I don't mean to try and dethrone Adam Smith here, but Morris was very much involved in not just the ideological elements of a free market, but he is a representation of what the free market does. And while, just like with anything, right, the free market is not a perfect system. However, it really is the best way to grow wealth. And for someone like Morris, for him to develop this wealth, it was a very big deal. A fun fact I learned is that one time he was venturing out, perhaps for business some kind in the Caribbean. He was actually captured by some French privateers in Cuba. He actually finally escaped, and I don't know how he did that, or maybe it was just a stroke of luck, or maybe he's just really good at escaping from people. But he did, and he was rescued by Americans. So a little fun fact here: I'm sure he would not have wanted to return to Cuba after that. And I'm not sure if he really liked the French after that, to be honest. But Morris was, again, very involved in these business activities, and when the Stamp Act comes around in 1765, he, like many others, were very angry. He was very angry at the Stamp Act, and probably there's a huge business reason why he didn't like it. I mean, if you're paying additional money for something, and you don't like you especially don't like the government, you're probably not going to want to pay it anymore. You're not going to like the people who are imposing this tax. And so he opposed it. But and the reason why I say the business reason is it could be the big argument that he might have made was because Morris was in that camp that did not openly support independence. In fact, he was a bit skeptical of independence. He was not confident really in the ability for the colonists to rule by themselves. He thought anarchy was going to really come out of that, and anarchy kind of did come out of it anyway, but he really was not comfortable with this idea of breaking away from the United Kingdom and going and really, I guess, drifting out to sea. And I'm sure he would appreciate that metaphor since he was a shipping like merchant. But he was someone who didn't like what Parliament was doing, but he supported negotiations with Parliament and wanted to find a way to chart a better course for the colonists, especially on tax policy. Now, he's not the first one, clearly, to not openly support or be very much in support of independence. We've seen that with some other signers. But he was probably, I would say, to this point in the series, he's probably the most outspoken about the fact that he's not that much in favor of independence. And we'll see a little bit later kind of what we mean by that. But he was nonetheless very, very, very helpful for the patriot cause. In particular, it is because of his money. Now, I know what some people are going to say. It's like, well, independence was not about money. And I agree that there is a huge ideological element to it. We cannot forget that the independence movement was driven by this idea that you cannot just have this idea, this whole thing of taxation without representation, which is exactly what was going on. You cannot have these grievances that are not being addressed by the British Crown and the British government. However, money was a big issue, and we, as you might recall, for those who started listening with the series back in middle of 2021, our first signer was John Hancock, who was a merchant himself, and so we kind of revert back to another merchant here, and Morris is really the guy who is able to provide a whole lot of money for the Continental Congress. And in particular, it's because Congress really didn't have any money. So it's kind of hard to fight a war of independence if you don't have any funds, not to mention how many angry people you're going to really have, especially the morale and the motivation, which was a big issue at the time when it came to paying soldiers and militias for their service in the war. And some of those problems would actually eventually catch up for the early republic that we started. Morris was really one of the main guys, main financiers. And so when Congress really couldn't come out with any money, and not to say they didn't have any money, but they certainly didn't have that much money to really, I guess, go around and say, oh, we got so much money, because who's going to believe them? And two, they really didn't have that much. And so Morris comes in, and he is actually selected to not only be someone really financing anything that Congress wanted, whether it was more ammunition, whether it was paying troops, whether it was ships. He was there to do all that, but he was also, I guess, in charge of these finances. And when you're in a situation like that, there's a couple things going on. First is that Morris is, with all that money, right, he's going to have a lot of say in these contracts, or in the kind of relationships that he has with other people who could be providing or I guess providing services and products for these contracts. But two, he's also going to build a lot of political capital. A lot of people are going to depend on him for his leadership and for the work that he's going to do. But thirdly, and this is something that is, I would say, would be more controversial if Robert Morris were to be discussed even more as part of a larger conversation about the founders, but he clearly profited from this position. And this is, we'll get to kind of the more complicated elements here a little later when we have our summaries or our takeaways of this episode, and really about Robert Morris. But just remember that there were people who were skeptical of what he was doing, and I guess just believed that that one couldn't really gain from this experience, that it all had to be public service. I don't know how that's really possible, to be honest, because at the end of the day, you kind of have to really you have to fulfill some element of self-interest and public interest, and it's best when they're both intersecting. But that was really the mood. Some people really just didn't like the way he was operating things. And there were times when, especially when he was working under the secret committee, which probably is not a secret when you tell people that it's a secret committee, but nonetheless, it was a committee of people who he knew and who secretly operated under his command and under his with regards to his relationships with others. He knew a lot of captains. He knew a lot of all these people, the merchants and the traders, and all these people who could really provide for the Continental Army and ultimately for the patriot cause. At the Battle of Trenton, Morris, as a good friend of George Washington, helped the army with money and weapons and all that. He was very much involved in a lot of these different causes throughout his time during the war. If I were to go back to 1776, just to cover our basis when it comes to the signers, Morris, as I mentioned earlier, was not a staunch supporter of independence. However, he felt that he was alone. He knew he was alone in that, or not, I guess not alone, but was certainly one of the few who really didn't have much of a shot at convincing other people his own opinions. So he decided that in the wake of the terrible times, with the troubling times, he decides to vote for independence as a form of unanimity. And there's actually a very interesting quote that I found from him, and it's something that he said, and we'll discuss a little later. And the quote is, "The duty of every individual to act his part in whatever station his country may call him to in hours of difficulty, danger, and distress," unquote. And he's basically saying that there are times when you have to do something to do what's best for the larger collective, especially when you are facing difficult times. With this signature in August of 1776, he is the 24th signer of the Declaration of Independence. Morris rejoined the Pennsylvania Assembly after his time as a representative in the Continental Congress, basically after his stint helping to represent Pennsylvania at the signing of the Declaration. And he gets involved in politics. He eventually becomes a senator from Pennsylvania, same state, from 1789 to 1795. Now, here's where things get very, very challenging here. And like I said earlier, Morris is able to get a lot of these people involved in the patriot cause because of his connections. And I would think that he did benefit quite a bit from his time during the Revolutionary War. Now, you might think that lasted quite a long time. Things, unfortunately, turned for the worse for Morris. And there are a couple sides to it. The first is that Morris had a number of political enemies. I don't know if it's because of his style or just because the fact that he had a lot of money. If I had to guess, I'd say it's because he had a lot of money. And you know what people do when it comes to how they look at wealthy people. There is a sense of jealousy. I don't think it's justified because unless that person got that wealth with illegitimate means and immoral means, that's very different. But if someone were to just gain that wealth purely because he or she earned all that money through legitimate business and went through the process of doing so with blood, sweat, and tears, then I don't think there is much of a justification to be jealous because what really is the point? But anyway, some people were just not happy with Morris, and there were all these different allegations against Morris on what he was doing as part of the secret committee. Now, if I were advising Morris, I'd probably tell him to never ever join something called a secret committee ever again because it just sounds really fishy. However, this was very detrimental to him, and I would think that it cost him some political capital later in his life. He actually faced a number of challenges. The first and probably the biggest one, and I would say this is a mistake on him, not to give him all the slack or to say that nothing he did was ever wrong. But he was involved in a lot of land speculation in the 1790s. Essentially, Morris thought that there was going to be a wave of immigration that was going to come to the United States. And a lot of these people would start populating and would start moving out west. So what he did was that he bought a lot of land in New York State and got actually 6 million acres in total in terms of the amount of land he controlled. So it is a huge, huge amount of land. And he was kind of really counting on this idea that the people were going to have places to live. Well, unfortunately, that wasn't the case because we had little something called the French Revolution. And what happened is that a lot of these immigrants, which he thought were going to basically come over and move to America, did not happen. And he took out a lot of loans, and eventually a lot of creditors started demanding money from him. And he really, really lost out. And I would say this is a huge, huge mistake on his part. And this is probably a good lesson on why gambling is not a way to be wealthy. This is it's such a tragic thing when you read something about this. But he knew that he wanted to profit from this, but at what cost? And unfortunately resulted in a very, very bad price, which I'll get to in just a few seconds. But a lot of his political enemies really saw this as not as a failure of even capitalism. Some people really criticized him so much to the point that that they wanted to move what would be kind of a more of an agrarian agenda, as I read somewhere, or come to a source from the Descendants of the Declaration of Independence website, actually. And Morris unfortunately could not get out of this situation. He actually declared bankruptcy in February of 1798. Was taken to the Prune Street debtors prison, and he was actually there for 3.5 years. Really, really shocking to see how someone could really fall from such a high point during the American Revolution to get down to that point, to such a low point in society. Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, and luckily Morris had a friend named Senator John Marshall, and Marshall actually helped pass a bankruptcy law in 1801, and that is how Morris actually was able to be released from debtor's prison. Because of all the different changes that have happened, including some very, very unfortunate incidents where, for example, Aaron Burr, we all know, with that infamous duel against Alexander Hamilton, Burr actually, as Attorney General of New York, actually filed a very, very partisan lawsuit against Morris. And Morris lost a lot of land from that. And some of that land is actually part of a state park, which I'm sure was not something that Morris was looking forward to at all. He probably would have wanted to just do it by himself without a lawsuit against him. But nonetheless, that is indeed what happened. Going back to how partisan that time was, I can't stress enough how we like to think that the 1790s was such a glorious time, and maybe there was some glory obviously coming out from the creation of the Constitution, ratification of the document, and the creation of the United States. However, it was still a very partisan time, and unfortunately Morris was caught in that partisanship. Morris was also one to not only be involved in politics for so much of his time, not just as a businessman, but he's actually one of 2 signers to sign the Declaration of Independence, the Articles of Confederation, and the United States Constitution. The other being our good friend whom we've already covered when it came to Connecticut, Roger Sherman. So a nice little fun fact, a nice little accomplishment for Mr. Morris. Morris was able to benefit, actually, going back to the Articles of Confederation. The significance of that really, again, relates to the American War of Independence. In 1777, when the Articles of Confederation was passed, it actually allowed Congress to ask for money from the states. The problem was that a lot of states did not do that, and so a lot of troops really struggled to get money. And Morris really was able to step in as one of the major financiers. I'm not going to say in this episode that Morris was the only person, that if Morris wasn't there, then the entire cause would not be there. But certainly without Morris, a lot of what happened during the American Revolution could not happen. And so Morris really becomes like a bit like a treasurer himself. He was not, secretary of the Treasury technically, although he was considered by George Washington to be the first secretary of the Treasury. But Morris actually recommended this fellow named Alexander Hamilton. And so you can see how, in another way, Morris kind of added to the history of the United States by recommending someone who I think was probably the best choice for the position at the time. After debtor's prison, Morris really was not able to recover his public credibility. He certainly was not able to live in the style he used to live in, with a large mansion and fruit trees and wealth and all that, and all those wealthy connections. But he was still able to live for a few years after. Because of the friendship he had made with Gouverneur Morris, who would sign the Constitution and would not actually be a delegate for the Declaration, but and nonetheless was a good friend of his. And because of Gouverneur Morris's friendship and kindness, Morris in this case, I realize there's two Morrises here, but Robert Morris would actually gain some kind of help from Gouverneur in the later years of his life. Robert Morris passes away in 1806, and he is buried right behind the Christ Church in Philadelphia. So that is a bit of a wrap on the history of Robert Morris, and so I'd like to now dive into some takeaways from Robert Morris and his time as one of our founding fathers. The first is that politics is too often a game of self-interest. It really is a brutal game. We like to think, I would say, in public discourse as a world where you can't serve your own interests. You have to live, breathe for the public interest 24/7, 365. Now, I want to preface by saying that self-interest is very complicated, because on the one hand, there's pure self-interest where there is no regard for helping anyone else. It's basically just making yourself wealthy no matter what, and even worse, at the cost of other people and of other resources. But I would say there's a different self-interest that is one. I'll use an analogy in this case here. If you ever been on an airplane, right, and they always have the safety video announcement, one of the things they always tell you is you have to put your, when you have the oxygen mask come down, you have to put your oxygen mask on first before you help others, right? Clearly, this is more of a safety reason, right? Because if you can't breathe, how can you really be able to help other people with their putting their oxygen masks on? Especially when it comes to kids, they usually show that adults need to put them on first before they help kids. The point of that analogy is to show that there is some element, however that is defined. There are people who are going to say, I need to fulfill some kind of self-interest so that I can put food on the table, that I can live comfortably before I can help others. That definition, of course, can be stretched in very, very strange reasons, right? However, my point is that I don't think we should just assume that public servants should never have any self-interest, because that is just not the reality. In fact, we voters have a self-interest. We vote. This is one of the strangest things about politics, which is we want to vote for people. We vote with this sort of idea that there are people who are going to serve for the public interests, and yet each of us has our own self-interest, but we don't really want to tell other people. We don't want to say, I want the economy to get better so I can make more money. We don't want to admit as a voting population that we want national security because I want to feel safe all the time, and with the help of other people. And it's not to say that those are necessarily bad things. It's just we need to have a bit more of an honesty element to the discussion of self-interest. And in this case here with Morris, right, we know that Morris had his own self-interest, and I certainly I would be so surprised if he didn't benefit at all from his time during the American Revolution. I think he said that for one of his deals when it came to ships or something, he broke even. Not sure if that's true. Maybe he just broke even in terms of number of ships. Like maybe he lost like a number of ships and then he gained them back. But the thing is that to motivate somebody like Morris to join a bigger cause, you have to incentivize these people. There has to be some kind of motivation for people to wake up in the morning and be able to help others, but we have to ensure there's some kind of survival element for the people who are serving in the public interest. And so I just bring up this first takeaway, which is it really is a game of self-interest where you have people who want to maximize it, and they might say, well, let's say 99% is for me, 1% is for other people. Let's say, right? Some people are just like, you know what, I really want to live out for other people, and that's of course is the most admirable trait. But if we are going to build a coalition of public interests, we have to have a coalition of people who have different self-interests, and it's the ability to once again have an intersection of how much people can gain for themselves and how much people can gain for others and for the larger society as a whole. If we don't attempt to fulfill those two to some degree, then I'm afraid we're never going to get the public interest. So that is just my little takeaway there, especially with the case of Morris. I think is a good example of, again, enticing someone to benefit him or herself while at the same time directly and indirectly benefiting everyone else. The second takeaway is that cash is king in politics, but I would also add that fiscal responsibility is also important in politics. Of course, fiscal responsibility is one of the 6 pillars of Washington's farewell address, which we discuss a lot, especially in the interview episodes. I would say that cash is king really is not just part of an old adage in life, and I should say that I do believe it's still true to this day, even with new currencies like Bitcoin and all that. I don't think that that's real cash. The real cash is really the cash that you hold, that you can hold in your hand. And I bring this up because too often we like to think that politics is really just about influence, and it is, right? But we like to almost kind of pretend that money doesn't matter. That we always say, kind of relating to the first point, we always say that, money shouldn't matter when it comes to public service. Money shouldn't matter when it comes to this. And I have to disagree. Now, where that money goes is a totally different conversation, right? If someone were to just enter public service because he or she wants to benefit all his friends and family and all that, no, that's not public service. But do we need money to incentivize people to join, say, the civil service, or for people to run for Congress, or for people to be appointed by the governor for the position of the Secretary of Business or Secretary of Environment? Absolutely. But we can't forget the importance of cash here, and notice I didn't say I didn't say like finances, because it's kind of broad, but it's really cash, hard cash. You've probably seen those instances of candidates who run for office and who get into a lot of debt. And they probably should learn from Robert Morris. It's like, well, this is what happens when you go from the very top to towards the bottom. I mean, Morris was so disliked by people from Philadelphia that his obituary was like 5 lines long or something like that in a local newspaper. That's the kind of a free fall that you can experience when you make bad decisions when it comes to money. And unfortunately, in this day and age, a lot of our political decisions are made by a combination of people who are in power who make bad decisions on finances. And I would say it's also the result of a number of voters making poor decisions when it comes to voting because of financial situations. A lot of times can be out of our control, but a lot of times I think it's people not realizing the implications and the consequences of putting yourself into mass amounts of debt. And as you can see, of course, with the example with Robert Morris, when you spec, especially when you gamble money that you don't have. It's really going to come back at you. And so this is just a bit of I see this not just as a takeaway from Robert Morris, but also a bit of a life lesson. That cash is always king. The cash that you have in hand, the cash that you can pay at the restaurant instead with a debit card. I mean, that sort of element here is still very, very important. And in the world of politics, it's really the people who are able to keep that cash, who are able to use cash to gain political capital, and hopefully for the betterment of society. Those are the kind of people we need to pay attention more to, and perhaps people whom we should elect more to the government today. Finally, we should set aside our own differences during difficult times that require unanimous support. This is stemming from the quote I read earlier to you by Robert Morris when he voted, along with the Pennsylvania delegation, to support independence. Too often in today's politics, with instant gratification being everywhere, we are just not doing, I think, good enough job of setting aside our differences when it comes to the larger picture. You've seen some examples of people who have set aside those differences. For example, with the certification of the electoral votes after the January 6th Capitol attack, we had a number of Republicans who voted alongside everybody else or with the large majority, not because they didn't have any issues with voting in certain states, but because they felt that there was a larger need to vote as unanimously as possible with the rest of the senators or representatives, as well as with the rest of the country. We've seen instances with appropriations bills where members of Congress will say, this is not a perfect bill, but I need to deliver something for the people, for the American people. And maybe that is just a talking point for certain members, right? But if we were to just take that member for word by word, that is actually a good sign that at least there's some people who are thinking about the complexities of the legislation they're voting on. Too often we just think that, and I say we as in as a society, some people I think really do a good job of figuring out what battles to fight and to understand that not every single point of contention is a battle. But I know that there's a number of people out there who don't want to admit that they have any kind of fault. They assume that anything that they do can be justified and that everyone should believe, but it should think exactly like them. And what happens is that a certain level of arrogance comes along. And I've seen that with some of these votes where, it's let's say it's 4-11-1 or something, or something like that, where I understand that you might have a point, but why can't you just address that point of saying, I don't agree with everything about this bill, but I'm going to vote unanimously because I think it's good for the larger interest, even if I have differences. Maybe there's another bill you can pass that can address those differences. But instead, people just want to stomp their feet and go home with their ball. It's like, I don't understand what the mentality of these people are. What I can tell you, though, is that at times when it's difficult, when people just need something, they need something to rally around. They need an identity to rally around, especially particularly a national identity when it comes to national crises. I hope that people will consider doing the right thing and joining the unanimous vote. If there are differences to be hashed, do so at a later time. Do so when it's not, at a time when people are running around like headless chickens. I've seen that at times when the invasion of Ukraine happened, and when the tragic invasion attack against Israel happens. I mean, these are trying times, and if we remove ourselves from those instances of tragedy and we get involved in these partisan politics, I'm afraid it's going to be a very, very difficult path. So I just encourage people, even if they're in a situation where they feel like they're not completely in sync with others, finding ability to rally around something that you can agree on, I think is a really good benefit. It promotes civility, promotes cooperation, and I hope it's something that we can all learn from Robert Morris with that quote, knowing that at times when there is a lot of danger, when there is a lot of difficulty, or distress, that we can be there and deliver for the larger collective good and to be able to continue to serve for the public interest. And so those are my 3 takeaways. Thank you all so much for listening to this episode of Robert Morris, our first signer from the colony of Pennsylvania. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure, once again, to subscribe to Friends and Fellow Citizens if you haven't already. Check out our email list down in the show notes below. Have a great rest of your week. And remember, a day in America is always better when we are with our friends and fellow citizens.